On behalf of the School of Public Affairs Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice program, I'm pleased to present today Mary Ellen Johnson, who will lead a topic discussion on kids doing life. She also has a video presentation that she'll show first. She also has a PowerPoint presentation she'll make. She will field questions after the video and after her presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ellen.
Thank you. My name is Mary Ellen Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Pendulum Foundation. We serve kids that are serving life. Now, I've been giving this presentation for several years, and usually I show a documentary that is called When Kids Get Life. That's a PBS Frontline. It's a 90-minute documentary, and that explains the whole issues of juveniles serving life without parole. Today I'm doing something else. It's a newer documentary called Lost for Life. It was premiered in 2013, and so it has a little different slant that I'll get into a bit later, but it does not tell the history of juvenile life in Colorado. So I'm going to take a few minutes before you watch Lost for Life and talk a little bit about how I got involved in the issue of juveniles serving life and the history of juveniles serving life without parole in Colorado. In 1992, I was a housewife and mother and a writer of historical novels. I did then and I do now live in Woodland Park. And on December 17th of 1992, a 15-year-old named Jacob Ind killed his parents in a wealthy subdivision right outside of Woodland Park. My daughter knew Jacob, and through a series of bizarre circumstances, I became involved in Jacob's case. Jacob at the time was barely 15 years old. And right before these crimes happened, my daughter came home and she talked to me about this odd boy in her freshman class. And he dressed like a hippie. He was just really strange and odd. But she liked him. He was nice. And for some reason, that conversation stuck in my mind. And so a few weeks later, when she came home and she said, "Oh my God, this is what happened," and we all knew. I mean, it made national news. Parricide is still a very, very unusual crime. I asked her, "Is that the boy you were telling me about?" And she said yes. So later on, I offered my services as a private investigator, a volunteer, and I spent the next year and a half talking to Jacob and uncovering the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his father, his stepfather and mother. And there's a book back there, The Murder of Jacob, if anybody is interested in reading it, or you can download it. And so Jacob was arrested. He was barely 15. He went to trial in 1994, and that's probably before a lot of you were alive. So since then, he has been serving all that time in prison. But at that time in 1994, there were a couple of things that were happening in Colorado and around the United States. Number one was there was something called this epidemic of super predators. I call them pint-sized super predators. That was making the news all over the United States, where they were saying, we are going to be overrun by monster juveniles. And so we have got to get tough on crime. So in that background, across the United States, we're going, yeah, if they're old enough to do the crime, they are old enough to do the time. So that was really the mindset then. And then in 1993, Jacob was arrested in 1992. But in 1993, Colorado had something called the Summer of Violence. And in the Summer of Violence, there were all up in Denver particularly, there were a lot of gang-related shootings. They all traced back to teens. the Colorado legislature held a special session, and a lot of really tough laws came out of that. Now, the background and retrospective of that is that all the harsh sentences dealing with teens for the summer of violence, there was a very small spike in crime, and the teens were, it was done by older people, not necessarily teens. But you have this story that is created, whether true or not. Everybody was terrified. So in 1993, we had that. Then at that same time, too, there was a case in California called the Menendez brothers. Have you guys ever heard of the Menendez brothers? I hope. Raise your hands, would you? So to see if I, oh, this is so discouraging. It just shows how old I am. It was an extremely well publicized case of these two hotshot kids in California married to, or their parents were quite wealthy, and the father was like a producer. These kids shot and killed both parents, a really bloody crime. And so as that was happening, and there's this national dialogue, well, you know, were these kids abused? And they were not kids at the time. They were 22. Remember, Jacob was 15. He wasn't even allowed to walk to McDonald's. But against this framework, were these older kids abused? Were they trying to take their parents' money? And so there was a national dialogue about this, and then there was stuff with the kids who were older buying Mercedes and doing all of this stuff. So since that, against that background, we also had, you know, this 15-year-old kid here in Colorado, and it was a very well publicized crime. And then the final factor was something called the abuse excuse, which was really making the rounds at the time. Is abuse an excuse for murder? And Alan Dershowitz was one of the premier people who said, no, it's not an excuse for murder. And so all of this stuff was happening against the background of Jacob Ine coming to trial. He came to trial in 1994. John Suthers, who is now your mayor, was the district attorney. He did not personally try Jacob's case, but he was overall. And Jacob was convicted, and he received life without parole. Jacob is the youngest person in the history of the state of Colorado to receive 2 counts of life without parole. The trial lasted 7 weeks, and a lot of stuff about abuse came out. Now, one of the things that I don't know if Colorado is unique, I doubt that we are, is if you go into a jury room and you're selected for the jury, you cannot know what, when you convict somebody of first degree, second degree, or whatever, you cannot know what that sentence means. So if you do a first degree murder, they cannot know that that means an automatic, mandatory life without parole sentence. So as the jurors were deliberating over this, a lot of them thought, I don't know if CSI was on at the time, but you know, we all think we know the system and we don't. But they were going, well, he's going to get a few years in treatment. And, you know, Judge Looney will be fair with him. And it's okay because, you know, he'll get the help that he deserves. And they did not know that they were, once they convicted him, they were sentencing him to life without parole. And Judge Looney even expressed disquiet over that verdict. However, there's nothing she could do. A mandatory sentence is a mandatory sentence. So in 1994, Jacob, along with any other kid in this system, when immediately after he was convicted, and by this time I think Jacob was 16 going on 17. By the way, he's 38 years old. He just had a birthday, and he spent all that time behind bars. But Jacob immediately went into the adult prison system because according to Colorado, Jacob Ine at 15 was an adult. According to the state of Colorado, whether you were 14, 15, 16, or 17, if the district attorney decided, we are going to charge you as an adult, there's no hearing, there's no nothing, there is now, there wasn't then, that the DA can charge you however he wants, and if he says, you're an adult, you're an adult, then you are an adult. So after Jacob was convicted, he went right into the adult prison system. How many of you are familiar with Colorado's prison system? How many of you have you gone to any of the facilities, or how many? So you have. Okay, yeah. So, well, our prison system is not like California or some places, you know. I mean, you can hear all kinds of horror stories, but I think our prison system is as good as it can get under the circumstances. But one of the problems for these kids, what are you going to do with a 15-year-old kid or a 16-year-old kid? And we had them going into the system. What are you going to do with that kid in the adult prison system? How are you going to protect him and from predators? Because you're going to get them. And so what generally happened at this time was that they started filtering most of these kids, including Jacob, into Colorado State Penitentiary, which you all know what solitary confinement is, don't you? And so a lot of our guys, we had 50 kids who were serving life without parole. And a lot of our guys spent years in solitary confinement until they got old enough and until changes were made to the Department of Corrections. So that's what happened to Jacob. That's what happened to all of our kids. Jacob, when he went in at 17 or whenever he was really into the system, he was sent to CSP for a pretty minor infraction right before he turned 18, and he was in solitary confinement for 7 years. So regardless of how you feel about crimes, I would just ask you to consider if you think that is a proper punishment. And furthermore, Colorado's not doing that anymore. There have been lots of changes there. But in the meantime, what happened in the state of Colorado was that there was a real pushback over the years against something called direct file. And direct file allows a prosecutor to directly file a juvenile into the adult system without, they say that they consider a lot of different things, but they file them into the adult system within a week's time. And so for, say, a case like Jacob's, you cannot possibly know the extent of the abuse or anything else in a week's time. So the prosecutor had unfettered power there. That is no longer the case. I think it was in 2012. They still have some power, but through a lot of pushback from a lot of advocates and a lot of people saying times are changing, we have to stop doing that it's much, much more nuanced. Also, what happened during this time was there was a shift in the thinking about juveniles. And the shift in the thinking about juveniles, we could trace it because the Pendulum Foundation has tried to push legislation for many years on this issue, and we could trace it from the initial years. And the legislators, they sit up on a dais, and you have hearings on this, and most of the legislators, their common comeback to us was, if they're old enough to do the crime, they're old enough to do the time. And they talked, when you mentioned brain science, which was in its infancy as far as gaining credibility, they poo-pooed that. They don't care because, you know what, a 7-year-old can kill just as easily as a 30-year-old with a gun, and you need to hold them accountable. That has also changed. So I sometimes get extremely discouraged because I think, you know, my friend is 38 years old, still sitting in prison. There are 47 other kids that are still serving life without parole in Colorado. There are hundreds that are serving the equivalent of life in Colorado, thousands across the United States. But when I look back at the change in the mindset, then I feel very encouraged. Now, a couple of other things that happened during this time is that in 2005, the United States Supreme Court passed something called Roper v. Simmons. Are any of you familiar with that? Okay, good. Did you realize before 2005 that kids could be executed? How many of you knew that in the United States? Okay, yeah, okay, it shows how old I am. Okay, well, children could be executed, and we were we were actually the only nation that did that. Some people will say, well, there's a handful that could have. But the United States stood alone. I think Saudi Arabia was the only other one at the time, and then they changed that. We stood proudly alone saying it's okay to execute kids. And then in 2005, the United States Supreme Court said, no, 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 you can't do that. And so that was step number one. And so we advocates are going, great. In 2010, I believe, there was something called the Graham decision. This is all through the United States Supreme Court. In the meantime, we are pushing legislation in Colorado all the time. We got one bill passed that says, in the future, any Jacobines get 40 years. You know, they cannot get life without parole. They get 40 years. So theoretically, they could come out of the system when they're 60 years old, whoopee. But so that was the first advancement in 20 years. In my opinion, it wasn't an advancement, and it's been a problem since then. But so Colorado, we got that pushed. We got some other things. We got a juvenile clemency board that was put into being that said also you have to treat juveniles differently when they go before you for a commutation, because you have to consider a whole different set of factors. Unfortunately, our current governor has declined to renew the Juvenile Clemency Board. So as the rest of the United States seems to be moving forward in many areas, and I'll talk about that a little bit, Colorado seems to be going backwards. But in 2010, the United States Supreme Court said that those serving felony murder cannot automatically get a life without parole sentence. Do you all know what felony murder is? So yeah, so if you don't commit the crime, you don't necessarily, if you don't kill somebody, you cannot get life without parole. And so that was fine. And then in 2012, there was a landmark ruling called Miller v. Alabama, I think. And that said that juveniles are different from adults, and they must be treated differently from adults. And there's a whole set of criteria about their reasoning ability, about their chances for rehabilitation, all the rest of it. They must have a reasonable chance for rehabilitation and for release. So that was huge, 2012. And so and this is only for those serving mandatory life without parole. Colorado had the 50 kids that were serving life, and so we fell under that. So that was really exciting. Now it's 2015. There has been nothing done in the state of Colorado. In fact, we have gone backwards. And what we have said, while all around us, West Virginia, you know how advanced West Virginia is? These kids have a chance for parole after 15 years. Doesn't mean they'll get it, but they have a chance. Colorado, no. Furthermore, we tried to run bills from 2012 to 2015. Unfortunately, the first year, the director, Tom Clements, was killed, and I'm sure you all know what happened to Tom Clements. And so then the bill died, and subsequently, we haven't even been able to get these bills out of committee, even though, again, across the United States, you know, they're falling like dominoes. In 2014, the Colorado State Supreme Court said, we will look at this issue of juveniles serving life. And the Attorney General said, for purposes of this argument, we're going to say it is retroactive, because that's been a big thing. Does it only apply to those going forward that this is cruel and unusual punishment, which is what the U.S. Supreme Court said? These sentences are against the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. And so that's what was argued before the Colorado State Supreme Court is do something, do something. And so the arguments were back and forth that this is not retroactive, it is. They should get 40 years as a default, all of them, or that should be defaulted to 16 to 48 years, which would be second degree. Take them all from first degree down to second degree. I'm not an attorney, as you'll be able to tell, but the weight of the law has been that you could do to second degree. That made the most sense. Well, I sat in on the arguments and looked pretty good. And then I talked to somebody who is very high up would be on my side of the issue, in the public defender's office, and this person runs a lot of bills. He's very sophisticated. I trust him implicitly, and he said to me, he said, Mary Ellen, has nothing to do with the law. That it is a very conservative Supreme Court now. They're mostly prosecutors. They are going to come back and they are going to say it is not retroactive, and they are going to say life without parole. Well, guess what? Year and a half later, that's exactly what they did. So Colorado, all of these kids that had a chance, Jacob and all the rest of them, they are back to life without parole. The United States Supreme Court is going to take up this issue. They're going to have the hearing on the 13th, so it will be tomorrow. And they're going to hear the oral arguments on whether this is retroactive, and then Colorado will have to act. And guess what Colorado will do? Our legislators, I can tell you this right now, will give them all 40 years. That is a problem, and that because you cannot do a one-size-fits-all justice according to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, the strategy behind that, I believe, is that, you know what, down the road, these kids may come out, but they're going to be in the courts for another 10 years. And so by that time, they're going to be serving 30 years anyway. So, and they'll be too old. So we don't care. But it doesn't matter if it costs you all a bunch of money, that's what we'll do. So to me, that is my version of what happens in Colorado, and that's some of the background. And I would love it later, because I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me and probably can do it very well. And against that background, this loss for life, I'll give you a little bit of background on that too. So loss for life deals with basically Colorado cases. But there's one case, and I think it is the most compelling and troubling. It's a case out of Idaho. And what I love about loss for life and what advocates hate about it, because I worked closely with the producer, and when you see after the 2012 ruling, what you'll see on loss for life, there's a whole group of advocates there, and they shot that at my house. And because the producer came back and he's gone, we got to get an update. Let's do it here. And so it was very hurried. But I think it's a marvelous film, and I think it's a marvelous documentary because there are no easy answers here. And I don't have them either. And the reason most advocates do not like loss for life is that they feel that it is not sympathetic enough. And my response to that is always, but you have to remember, most of these kids, not all of them, but most of them killed somebody. And so, this is not even a robbery or whatever. So this is a very, very difficult situation. And the other thing is that if we do not have the better part of this argument and both sides cannot be shown, then we don't have a very strong argument. And I think that we do. So having said that, loss for life details crimes, and it details some of the aftermath of the crimes, and there are two locally who were involved, and incidentally, I think they're both, it's either Jacob was Teller, and I think the other two, it was Green Mountain Falls. So the crimes in here are basically Colorado. The people who have redemption, the one that you'll see near the very end, he's also from Colorado. So while this is not explicitly Colorado, it deals with a lot of these issues. I think it's a wonderful film. And after we're finished, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about it, because I'd like your feedback. This is the first time, other than a premiere back in D.C., that I will have an opportunity to talk to people who have actually seen it. I don't know what the reaction is going to be. But the premise of loss for life is just a question. Could you forgive? And that's what I'm going to ask you guys to think about and talk to me about. Could you forgive? Could you forgive a kid who was abused and killed his abusers? Could you forgive somebody who did I guess two of them that did kind of a thrill killing? Could you forgive a gangbanger who shoots into a crowd and kills somebody and then later on is redeemed, are some crimes so heinous that they cannot be forgiven. And that's the thing that fascinates me about Lost for Life. I hope that you all will be fascinated too. Any thoughts about the film? Who do you think, as I've gotten feedback from the film, who do you think that may be the most controversial figures in the film? Yeah, absolutely. And what were your thoughts on them?
Well, even though they seem to be, oh, yeah, we did a bad thing, I really regret doing these things, it was their mindset during the murder. They knew what they were doing. They stabbed that girl, even though they say, oh, I love her, rest in peace, while I crap. No, I'm sorry. That during the murder, they didn't have that feeling at all. So.
Okay. Yeah.
I actually somewhat disagree with what I said. Brian, the first one, he actually feels remorse, and he acknowledges the fact that he did something wrong, and although it can't be completely forgiven, Tori, the second guy's parents, are completely oblivious to the fact that he committed this horrible act too, and he doesn't want to face the reality of the situation. He just completely disregards it, like, oh no, it was totally Brian. I didn't do anything. I'm in here serving the sentence for what Brian did, but they were both equally guilty in the situation.
How did you feel watching Tori on screen? I know his family, and again, they're in Idaho, and I know his mom a little bit, but what was your reaction to him on screen?
I feel like he has a complete lack of remorse. He just seems cold and like he doesn't understand the magnitude of the crime he committed. Like he just brushes it off like it's not a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
Well, and then I heard his dad saying you're serving a time for someone else's crime, and so that also shows that he understands the remorse for what he did, because obviously he told his parents he didn't do two things. His parents were saying that he's the one who planted the idea in Ryan's head to kill her, because he had the idea of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
I think Tori, to me, is one of the most dangerous people to potentially let back into society for the lack of remorse for his actions, because that carries through your entire personality, in my opinion. The feeling that he's innocent completely, like he said it probably at least 7 times that he's innocent,
Mm-hmm.
I think that carries through your entire personality throughout every aspect of his life, probably. So if he has any potential with all the different rulings that are going through, I think that's one of the most dangerous people to put back into our society, because he clearly does not think he should be held accountable for anything that he doesn't directly do,
Right.
which can be potentially horribly dangerous, depending on what kind of situations or people that he falls into.
Yeah, and I'll comment on that in a minute, but now, can you cut them some slack in the sense that they're quite young? Somebody like Jacob or Sean Taylor, they're pushing 40. These kids they're still they're maybe 22, 23. Do you think that makes a difference, or do you think somebody like Tori and even Brian, that they are totally irredeemable?
I don't think Brian's irredeemable, but I think Tori is, because you can tell that it's not because he's young. He truly, genuinely believes that that's his personality trait, that's a flaw, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It's in his mindset, and I don't think that's going to change with time. When you compare it to like Sean Taylor, he was just young and stupid, and it clearly changed. The irrational thought that he's innocent is not being young and stupid. He really truly believes that, and that's in his fibers of his being.
No responsibility for anything. I think it's also very interesting, the contrast between Tori's parents and Brian's, and I'm sure Josh set it up that way, but when I watched this, and I haven't watched it a lot, it's too troubling to me, but it's very interesting. I don't know Brian's parents, but I know Tori's, and so there couldn't be more of a contrast and lack of responsibility. Yes?
I think it's kind of a scary and irrational thought to think that Brian just, yeah, he does seem remorseful. I would hope somebody would feel remorseful for killing somebody and watching them die. The fact that bothered me is, this is a pretty famous case, and they didn't mention at all in
It's almost
regardless of
the
their age.
ultimate thrill kill. Or, that's a tough one, and I think that's why Josh filmed it, and I think that's why he began the documentary with it. And before he settled on these cases, he had gone to Florida, and he was going around the U.S. trying to figure out the cases that he wanted, and he had talked with some girls who had committed murder. And there was such a lack of self-awareness, and it wasn't even interesting. And I think he chose them because it is, these are two middle-class boys, and this is what they do, and the contrast between the two. But as Josh said to me, and I did not know Brian at all, but he said to me, I love Brian. He said, I think I have so much compassion for him, and he said, and I think he should never come out. So that was his take on him, but it's very difficult. But then you flip back to the murder and how this documentary started with the close-up, and it's one of those things that I ask myself, is that forgivable? And I'm an advocate, and I don't have easy answers. Yes?
It makes a big difference, don't we get to see the actions preceding the actual murder through the videos. It makes a whole different new realm of eerie to it. You see how much fun and enjoyment they get out of it. It's harder to feel sorry for them.
Mm-hmm. But then, if you say that a child, they're kids and they don't understand, is that not even an explanation, or an excuse, not or an explanation? It's that they're very tough for me.
Yes, normally, but I guess, like I said, you have that concrete video to be able to see it. Just brings you back to that moment and thinking, how can anybody at any age come to those thoughts and actually go through with their actions?
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to feel sorry for the when they have a really hard background. If they had they were victims themselves, it's a lot easier to be understanding of it. But I understand the majority of us here don't think about killing our parents, so it's kind of hard to think. I generally never think about that as a day, so it's like it's hard to think about with that.
Any other thoughts or comments on that? Now, what were your thoughts on the two victims? They showed Jennifer Bishop Jenkins, and her sister, of course, was brutally murdered, and she has become a national advocate against these kids coming out. She's against the death penalty, but she's very much against juvenile life without parole. Or Charlotta Evans. What are your thoughts? Do you think Jennifer's position is really I won't even say understandable, but if you were her or Charlotta, what side would you come down under? And I've always said I'd probably be more like Jennifer. So, but yes.
I mean, their opinions are justified. Their sides where they take on to where they don't want to come out are completely justified. My sister was killed with my niece and nephew in her stomach. There's no way in hell am I going to initially forgive the people that killed him. I'm not going to seek vengeance. I'm not going to seek justice because the justice system already did their job and locked him up. Then that worked. But if they're considering on bringing him out, then yes, I'm going to oppose that. I'm not going to wish death upon them because that's not that that doesn't work in that case. But if they're going to bring him out, they killed my family, and it's justified to where my stance is.
But how would you respond to this? Jennifer says they should never come out. Her sister says that they should. She's met with the killer. She wants him to have a second chance, and she fully supports him. What do you think about that?
For me, no. I'm sorry. It's it's still my family, and you took away a new life that hasn't even been brought into the world. It doesn't matter if you believe that a fetus is alive or dead. It's the fact that you already took another person's life out of it.
But and I understand that, but should Jennifer's opinion weigh more than her sister's?
Which one's Jennifer again?
Jennifer is the one who said, yeah, well, no, there's a lot of
There's so many
different.
names like
No,
that.
she's the one that her sister was killed in the basement, and she was pregnant, but her sister, who was not shown, she has come out very strongly recently for an end to juvenile life without parole. She's met with the killer. She has a whole different take on the killer, and so again, which should weigh more?
That's just her opinion. I mean, obviously, yeah, she's forgiven the killer. She's forgiven everything that he's done and taken off what. That's fine. That's how she's able to deal with it. I mean, it's not. I'm saying that I haven't forgiven the killer, because probably after about 10 years, I probably have. I don't know. I've never been in this situation before. Okay, but I don't know how I would react to my family saying that the killer of one of our own gets to go free to have that second chance. I mean, where's the second chance for my sister?
I agree. I mean, it's very difficult. That's why I like this film. Yes.
I kind of agree there, but at the same time, it's kind of like what he said. It's like, how can we determine how we would feel about the situation unless it's actually happened to us? Unless that was our family who was victimized, and we had to suffer and go through all the grief and everything. So how can we say, like, how we would feel about the killer until we've been put into that situation ourselves?
Yeah.
So I don't really understand.
But remember, these are also children, and in some of these cases, because I know them, the victims have come forward at the time of the killings and have said, I don't want them to get life. Some of them have said, I don't want them to be tried as an adult. And that is ignored. Why is that ignored? But if there is a thirst for vengeance, that is not ignored. I'm just asking. I mean, because this is, I think, kind of the way our system is. But that always puzzles me, and actually it angers me because it seems very unfair. Okay, over here. Pardon?
I don't think either opinion should be taken more so over the other. They should both be taken into account. Because obviously they both lost a loved one, but their opinions shouldn't weigh more than the other, especially because they're opposing. Obviously they both feel strongly about it, but one's more forgiving than the other.
And that is the conundrum for me, is that we feel like a lot of our legislation is stifled because of victims groups, but they're not the victims groups, because there are some out there that say give them a second chance. They're victims that are saying, no, they should never come out. And so I think there should be a balance, and that doesn't seem to be the case, from my opinion. Okay.
Do you think that they should draw the line at like how much the killer would love? Because like for kids who commit parasite, it's kind of different than someone who just decides to go on film. So do you think there should be like balance between that, and that's where the line should be drawn?
Well, the Supreme Court came out, because that's a very good question. And in the case of parricides, unfortunately, one of the criteria for first-degree murder is premeditation, and in parricides there's almost always premeditation, because these kids, some of them, have been thinking about this from the time they were little. I mean, you know, that's somewhere it's just a fact if they've been abused. And so then the court pulls that out, and they're going, yeah, this is, this kid's going to get life. And I would like to also say, because it wasn't brought out in this, but parricide is very rare, and in Colorado, most of these kids that have killed their parents certainly have not gotten life without parole. There are only two people that have gotten life without parole. One is Jacob, and one is another kid who you would meet if you watch When Kids Get Life, Nathan Ibanez. And following Jacob's conviction about 10 years later, there was a case in Monte Vista in Colorado, John Cottle. He was almost Jacob's age. He was badly abused by his mom, nothing from his stepfather. John Cottle blew him away. John Cottle got 20 years. And so, and with good time and earned time, he'll be out before too long. Hooray, that's wonderful. That shows what we're doing is working. But what are you gonna do about those in there that were caught up in this larger and I guess more punishment-prone time? And so they're supposed to rot. I mean, the case before the U.S. Supreme Court about retroactivity is dealing with a teenager who went in 1969 is still sitting there. So those are my gripes about it. Okay.
I was gonna say so much over again. I just feel like you can look at both sides, but we have to look at how society could view it. Because if you say, oh, it's okay for he should get out within a certain amount of time because he feels bad for what he did or whatnot, how is society gonna view that? I mean, are they gonna find it okay? Then how are the kids gonna be like it's okay to do that? I mean, they're not gonna say it's okay to do that, but you really have to think about society and how they're going to view it.
Yeah, but you know, because you're all criminal justice majors, you also understand that a lot of crime goes down after they become a certain age, 35 or 40, it all goes down. That longer terms in prison are not effective, and unless you're dealing with a psychopath or serial killer, and then those need to be weeded out. But there are a lot of studies that say that what we are asking for is not implausible or is not reckless or would not endanger the public safety, and yet this is a very emotional issue, and just as this gentleman said, I also put myself in the situation if that were my child or my grandchild. So, there are not easy answers here. Are there questions, comments?
I was like really surprised that the guy who was a gang member got parole just because he had joined the gang at such a young age, and going into gang like related activities that you could be shot or you could shoot someone. I was just surprised that he got parole because
It's sentence commuted. Well, and yes, I was very surprised too because I had conversations with people before Governor Ritter commuted a sentence, and I actually saw his original packet, his commutation packet, and I was going, this guy's never going to get a commutation. He's African American, he's a gangbanger, and white middle class America or Colorado is not going to let this guy out. It shows that I've been wrong about everything so far. And Sean Taylor had a good reputation inside. Sean, by the way, is a wonderful human being, and he had a good reputation inside. Everybody knew he changed his life around. But we have several that have totally changed their lives around and are sitting there. So I don't know why Governor Ritter did it. And at the time, there were 4 juveniles that got their sentences commuted. And one actually, Sean came out right away, one actually will be going into community corrections tomorrow after 5 years. He served almost, he served over 30 years for a hit and run. So that I understand why his sentence was commuted. But at the time, we were going, 4 out of, there are hundreds of juveniles in here. What, just 4? And now we look back on that as the good old days because there isn't even a board now. So, I don't know what happened with Sean. He would almost say it would be divine intervention, but I do say it was a very, very good choice. Sean is part of something called Second Chance Center up in Denver. They just got a big reentry grant for $800,000 to help returning prisoners. He's one we don't have to worry about. Governor Ritter also commuted Chuck Limbrick, who killed his mother back in, it's been a long time ago. His sentence was commuted twice. Chuck, I think, is being sentenced for, he got in trouble drinking and driving and hitting somebody, and he probably will go back in. So it's very difficult for these guys to stay on the straight and narrow, but Sean Taylor's one who has. So he is our shining star. Yeah.
For Sean, I can understand he was 14 or 16 when he was first put into shot. He knew that, okay? But I don't think he knew that was going to happen. It might happen. He never thought it actually would come up. So I could see why his sentence got commuted, because he was a kid that grew up in the gang life, especially in the Bloods, which is one of the biggest gangs in America, and one of the more ruthless ones too. So I can understand that, like, why his sentence got commuted, because in jail he could have started gang wars too.
Absolutely.
He could have just been in the middle of it all, killing prison guards, everything. Like, he could have been in the middle of it all. But he decided to change his life around and recognized it. And he, you know,
Yeah.
it was a dumb mistake
Yeah.
and everything else. I can understand why his sentence got commuted. I mean, even though the circumstance you bring up, white middle class America or Colorado, and, you know, I understand that too. But, you know, it was something that he has regretted ever since he came in, ever since he went into the system. And I mean, he's never been flying his colors ever since. He told everybody else, you know, he's done.
And the thing, there was a lot of remorse, but we have several cases. There's one in when Kids Get Life, Frontline again, where this kid, it was an accident that he discharged a firearm during a robbery. He kills this kid. They were both the same age, they were friends. And Trevor it's been right up free. He is, everybody loves Trevor inside. And he never got a sentence commuted. And the reason we believe that he didn't is he's got victims who are adamant that Trevor should never ever come out. I understand that. That should be one factor, but it should not be the only factor. But you're right. We've got some of these kids, and I could name them off, or you know, when I talk to people privately, most of them have outgrown any sort of gang affiliation, but some of them haven't. One of them that Sean was working with, the Pendulum Foundation has a college scholarship for these guys, which wouldn't it be wonderful if it actually paid for college? We can give them one class a year, or one or two, and because they get their own programs inside. And so this one, when we all thought that the Supreme Court was going to let these guys out, well then you realize the ones that are sincere and the ones that are just doing this because they think it'll look good in their sentencing reviews. So we have a lot of guys that had never taken an interest in programming, that all of a sudden they're gone, well, you know, I want to take these programs, and I understand it, but I know that their attorneys are just saying it'll look good. So one of them, his attorney just begged me to get him a scholarship. And then there were some problems with it, but anyway, I got the scholarship, and he didn't take the class. And so Sean Taylor writes to him, and he asks this kid about it, and Ahmad said, don't bother to write to me again. He said, I'm a gangbanger now. I've always been a gangbanger. And he said, I'm not going to change. Now, do I want that coming out? No, I don't. But what I do believe is that that's what these criteria, that's what a judge, that's what a sentencing review is all about, because that guy is not coming out, and he shouldn't come out. He's much happier inside. There's lots of other gang members, like Sean said in this documentary when he said, you know, there's gang members all around me in prison, because one of the things that I hear all the time from people inside is they will say, I want to get out of prison so that I can teach other juveniles not to do this, or so that I can do some good and go to communities and talk to people. Well, you know what? You can do it inside. You don't have to wait. Your life, unfortunately, is not on hold. You can do it inside. You can make a difference, and I think that was one of the big things with Sean. He's not the only one, but he made an effort. And a lot of these guys are just, well, I can't do this, I can't do that, and it's not just teenagers. You know, it's guys that go in older. So, no, Sean is a special case. No, he's not a special case. I think there are several like him that would do well, and if they were given a second chance. So. Any other questions, comments on the film? Let me see, because we got time to go here. Let me see. Okay, so I think we talked about this you know that we're the only nation that sentences kids to die in prison. And that, have you guys heard of the Convention of the Rights of the Child? Yes, absolutely. Do you know anything about it? Right, and that's just a list of all kinds of things that you know, they have a right to shelter, they have a right not to be abused, you know, things like that. It seems very non-controversial, and yet since the 1990s, the United States has fought that. And the reason they fought it, one of the reasons is that in the 90s, people said, well, if you really look into the language, that would mean that I, as a parent, have no control over my child. I could not spank my child, which is BS, but that was enough to stop it. Right now, the United States is the only nation on the planet that has not signed the Convention for the Rights of the Child. Somalia was the other holdout, it just signed. So we are the only nation that feels like not only dealing with juveniles serving life, but we're the only nation that feels like, you know, I guess it is that we have total control over every aspect of our children, even if we want to beat them in the name of good parenting or whatever. So, okay, and you also, one of the things that we're wrestling with now, because there are some parole issues that are coming up, and our guys are not going to get parole. But, of course, when you talk about violent offenders, nobody wants supposedly violent offenders out on the street. But the problem also is, what is a violent offender? Because, you know, when I say violent offender, what would you think of a violent offender as? What would you consider a violent offender to be? Right, yeah. And anybody else, is it all, it's murder and rape, isn't it? And actually, that's what we all think about, but it's a whole panoply. It isn't, you know, violent offenses could be sticking up somebody with a gun or something and you don't do anything. Inside prison, if you jerk your away from a guard or something like that, that can be considered assault. So we have certain preconceived notions that I think allow us to continue with this unhelpful retribution phase that we're still in as a society. And, but I'm sure you all know that, or do you? Who would you really want out on the streets? Say, would you want somebody who would be more likely to reoffend? Would it be somebody like I'm not going to use a Jacob, but a gun is discharged and he, in the course of a robbery, and he kills somebody. Or Sean, that is taking of a human life. Who would you rather have out? Who would be the best candidate? Him or somebody who just gets in trouble for low-level offenses? And he's got a long jacket, but it's for minor stuff. And he keeps going into the system, but then he comes out, but he's never done anything major. Who is a better candidate, really, for rehabilitation? Yeah.
That's an inadequate question, in my opinion, because you could have a person not be such a bad criminal, go into the system, and end up coming out worse than they were before. Who knows what kind of interaction they're going to have in there? That's why the way they're planning to do it on a case-by-case basis with evaluations and all that's the way to go. To get a more accurate depiction of who it is rather than just make a blanket statement saying, well, you know what, let's just protect ourselves.
Well, and that is exactly what the Supreme Court meant when they said mandatory, because that is then equating the worst of the worst. We got one guy in there who's he killed 5 people during a drug bust or something, I don't even know. And then you have this over the other side would be somebody who was in a drive-by shooting and he didn't shoot the weapon, but it's a felony murder. And all ranges in between, and that's what the Supreme Court said, you cannot treat them all the same. And you know, that's actually all we've ever asked for. And so what always happens is that when we say that, then they immediately start dragging out the worst cases, because we got some bad ones, and they're not coming out. And also the victims who are against this. Not the victims who are for, we have them and we bring them out, and so it's like a standoff. I get so tired because I think there has to be a better way for us to talk to the opposition and for the opposition to talk to us. And I don't know what it is. That's why it might be lovely if, you know, if all of you go into the criminal justice system and can maybe look at things a little bit differently. Because I think we're pretty much stalemated. I also, though, do know that over time this is going to change, but then you're already hearing things like, well, murder's going back up, and which it actually, I guess, is not. And so then the pendulum has started to swing towards rehabilitation more, which does work. But already it's like, oh no, we can't do that. And so what's going to happen? I personally believe that we can't afford to do it, so we may not care about anybody inside, but financially we can't continue doing it. It's just too expensive. So, you know, for whatever reason, if it's just that it's bottom line, this will continue to change, I believe. So, any other comments? Yes?
What do you think of the privatization of the prison industry? Prison system?
Now, what did you say about?
What do you think of the privatization of the prison system?
Well, I think that it's a real problem because, let's go back. I mean, you're all students, and I've been around a really long time, so I remember when privatization was where we wanted to head, and that in the 80s when Ronald Reagan came in, and I was one of the advocates that are going, yeah, private companies can do anything better than the government. The government is too big and too cumbersome. Well, what we've seen after all these years, no, not necessarily so, and the private corrections industry has to make a profit. And so some people believe that the rising rate of incarceration is fueled by a lot of the private prison industries, because you have to have beds. You have to have people to fill those beds. And I do know that the guards in a lot of the private corrections industries, they're not paid well. You know, they don't have a lot of training. And supposedly there are programs. On the other hand, I do know some of our not our guys, but they're former juveniles that are in the private industry or the system, and they kind of like it because it's like, oh, we're left alone. So I don't know, but I think overall I don't think it's a good thing. And you all know about Colorado State Penitentiary 2 that was built. You all know about ADSEG, and what had happened over time was when Jacob and them were going in, they were all filtered into the solitary confinement, and that's where they would stay for years. And the head of Department of Corrections plus a lot of our legislators said, Colorado has a lot of really, really bad people, and they have to be put in ADSEG for years at a time. We don't do that in Europe, and we don't do it in other places, but we have to do it here in the United States. And so Colorado built, to the tune of $250 million, they built a second facility down in Canyon City. It's called, I call it CSP2, I don't remember what it's called. And that was opened, and it wasn't even partially filled. And then when the executive director of corrections, Tom Clements, came in, there was again the pendulum swinging, and he said, we don't need that facility. We don't need it. Solitary confinement is overused. These people go in and come out crazier than when they went in, and plus it is a holding cell for the mentally ill. And so Tom Clements did an intensive survey of all the people that were in solitary confinement, and he started emptying out, actually, bringing people out of solitary. Because he said, you know, again, this is counterproductive. It's inhumane, but it's counterproductive. And so CSP2 has sat empty for many, many years, and we, the taxpayers, are picking up that $250 million tab. Ironically, Tom Clements, as you may know, was assassinated by somebody who had spent a lot of time in solitary. So, you know, he knew what he was talking about, and unfortunately a good man was gunned down by one of the people that had been kept inside. Any other comments? Let me see what I've got here. Okay, I'm going to try. Uh-oh, do I click this thing? Oh, there it goes. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system, our criminal justice system as in comparison to the criminal justice system in Denmark. This would be also indicative of Europe. I don't know any other European nation or any European nation that sentences people to die in prison, adults or juveniles. But I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to be able to go to Denmark and to be able to look at one of their facilities and do some research on it. And so Denmark is one of the, it actually is not a leader, but it is one of the Scandinavian countries that Department of Corrections and other people were actually looking at to say, can we do something better here? So Denmark, it's a lovely nation. Let's see. So Denmark, has about the same population as Colorado. It's a lot smaller. It's a lovely country. It's pretty flat. And it's very homogeneous. So they don't have a lot of the other. We have a panoply of different races, etc. here, and a lot of people say that's why they don't mix well, and so that's why we have to keep people behind bars, which I disagree. But people, when they say Denmark does better than we do because they don't have a lot of other nationalities. So Denmark has 4,500 prisoners. We've got about 20,000. That is one of their facilities. I toured a medium facility, which would have had some murderers too, and it was nothing at all like our facilities. Oh, what do we have here? When I was in Denmark, I spoke to several classes of university students, and they had seen When Kids Get Life, and their English is actually wonderful, and it was very enlightening. But anyway, they had watched it in English, and then we had a conversation afterwards. And what really, really surprised me, it was the difference in different assumptions that the Danes have in comparison to us. And one of the things, I don't know, but some people might say when they think of the Swedish countries, they think socialist, godless, whatever. And of course, America is a Christian nation. And what really surprised me was the attitude of the Danish students, almost 100%. Their attitude was from, they started their conversation from the vantage point that no kid is born bad. All kids are born, if they do something bad, it's because bad things have happened to them. That was a shocker to me, because I don't know if it's because as Christians we believe in the concept of original sin. I don't know. But the idea, because every group that I speak to, there will be people in that group who have gone, hey, there's just bad seeds. Some people were born bad. Not going to argue that. But in Denmark, they said it is never, ever kids that are born bad. That surprised me. And of course, they don't believe that anybody should ever get life, and they don't. And that's exactly, if a child commits a heinous crime because they saw Jacob's story and the story of several others, it's because of a mental illness or their environment, abuse in their environment. It's not because that they are inherently born bad. And one of the things, I don't know if this is, I don't understand these things, but anyway, when I toured a facility, and one of the things that really surprised me was that they didn't have the wire around the facility, and this is a medium facility. And when you walk into the facility, they don't have cells really, they have dorms. And so they've got their own private shower, they've got all of this stuff. They have on weekends, they have family visits. Remember, we are a nation that values family, except when it comes to prison. But they have conjugal visits because, my God, in the United States, you do not want to have prisoners have sex because they're being punished. Well, in other nations, they feel like conjugal visits, things like that, are keeping a family together. And also, you know, why do you punish the family for what the offender has done? So they get they get lots of therapy. They have a communal kitchen, and in the communal kitchen they have knives like this big. And as I was walking through, and they got prisoners running in and out, and I was even nervous because in the United States there's only a few places where you could do that, and they would be chained. They allow all of that, and because their attitude is if you treat these people like they're human, if you give them therapy and all the rest of it, they will behave like human beings. And a lot of them go home on weekends. And so for me, it was really mind-blowing, because if what we are looking for is to lower the recidivism rates, which 2 out of 3 go back into prison, if that's what we're looking for, why aren't we more like Denmark? Because they don't recidivate. So is that what we're really looking for? Or is what we're looking for retribution? And I just ask because I don't know.